it's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kim Nalder. Kim is probably well known to many of us, at least, because she has presented to us at least twice that I recall. But Kim is a professor of political science here at Sacramento State, and she focuses on public opinion, political communication, California politics, voting behavior, elections, political disinformation, and political behavior. We have to do everything. You're a full service professor, right? Yeah, okay. But she writes on her page, she says, "My current research focuses on political psychology." Think about that, political psychology and political behavior. So I think we are in for a very interesting talk today. But Kim, I should mention, received her MA from Utah State University and her MA and PhD from UC Davis. So thank you, Kim. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone making their way out here, and you brought your water wings, I guess, to get here today. Yeah, and I don't know if you were dreading today's talk or looking forward to today's talk. I don't know. I had mixed feelings about it myself. So a little bit more about what I do my research on, because that will be relevant when we get into the talk. So I do political psychology. I do misinformation. I've been studying misinformation since 2011, when I had to define what it meant to crowds, and that's no longer the case, as you well know. I also run the Project for an Informed Electorate. So it's a project here on campus where we try to inform voters in a nonpartisan way about politics and policy. We put on an initiative explainer every election cycle with the Legislative Analyst's Office. So it's the people who actually write the official ballot guide. And so they describe the measures, and then we provide additional information about endorsements and campaign expenditures and so forth. And we make videos of those available online. I know I'm saying this a little too late, but in 2 years from now, if you want to check those out, they're on our website. We also have students help us put on other events, and we'll have we had several events. The most recent one was Wednesday. We did a postmortem of the election, which will be available online tomorrow, or maybe today if I can get to it today. And that's actually edited nicely too. So if you want to check that out. And then we'll have some additional events in the spring. We're having one on misinformation and one on the black vote. And I don't know what else. We'll do some more, but that's what we have planned so far. We don't have the exact dates yet, but if you check the website, you can check for that. So I want to preface my talk by saying there has been a big challenge for political scientists and journalists since the Trump era began. Journalists and certainly most, not all, but most political scientists intend to be objective and unbiased in our work. We don't want to be partisan or advocate particular policies. Through most of my career, I felt like I've done a pretty good job of that. At one point, I had students taking bets about what my partisanship was, which actually, if you know anything about political science professors, that's not a good bet. But it's been a struggle since the Trump era, because we're no longer talking about conservatism versus liberalism. We're not talking about small government or traditional conservative policies. We're increasingly talking about democracy. And I will advocate for democracy. And unfortunately, that can be conflated with partisanship. It'll look partisan, sound partisan. That's not my intent. But it's the way it turns out, and that you can talk to Donald Trump about that. It's not my fault. So just with that in mind. So I'm thinking about what this election means for democracy and how we can explain some of that and hopefully flesh out some of, oh, of course, this isn't working now. There we go. Okay, so first of all, I want to ground what I talk about today in kind of the bigger picture. I know you've seen lots of hot takes from pundits and so forth, talking about exactly what happened with different portions of the electorate and so forth. But I want us to back up a little bit and look at kind of the broader view and integrate it into what we know from a political science standpoint as well. So first of all, this was not a landslide election. Oh, never mind. So it wasn't a landslide election. One of the problems in the way we do our political reporting in this country is that the journalistic outlets are really intent on getting the call of the election immediately, right? And that can be problematic and can sometimes even influence outcomes. So if we go back to 1980, Jimmy Carter conceded before polls were closed on the West Coast. And some people left, the line where they were intending to vote, and that may have changed the outcome of some races. In this current election, it's more about vibes. And in 2000, the vibes really mattered because at the end of the day, it looked like it was a Bush win, even though it was still up in the air and there was recounting being done and it officially was not decided. But it allowed Bush to call Gore sore loser man and, all of that in that interim, right? So the presumption was that one outcome had already occurred rather than it was still up for grabs. In this election, it's we early on saw the call, which looks to be holding up, but the popular vote is increasingly getting closer, right? Because the counting is still happening on the West Coast. We're getting pretty close, but the West Coast is more blue, and the votes came in later from the West Coast, and so that margin is shrinking. Reporting that early allowed for President Trump to claim, more of a landslide and a mandate and so forth than is realistic. So if we look at it right now, it's at about 2.5 million votes different, which, that's substantial. It's 48.3% for Harris, 49.9% for Trump, so slightly less than half, right? Like not a majority of the folks. That margin is actually fewer than Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by, fewer than Biden won by, fewer than Obama won by, fewer than George W. Bush won by. So this is actually a fairly close popular vote election, but you wouldn't know that hearing some of the commentary, especially early on. Candidates often claim a mandate. That the voters have decided and they've overwhelmingly come out in favor of me. If we look at the Electoral College, it does look more like that. But if you look at the popular vote, that's not true. And mandates just on the face don't really make a lot of sense because we don't know what was in voters' minds, and all voters weren't thinking the same thing or concentrating on the same issues. And so they're always a little made up, but we'll see a lot of that isn't as warranted as it could be. Second thing I wanted to point out is that this might be a little small, but the polls, people always want to know about the polls. One of the things I failed to mention in the intro is that from 2015 till last year, I ran the polling organization for the university called CalSpeaks. We ran out of funds, so we closed up shop. So I know a little bit about polling, and I teach public opinion as well. The polls are within the margin of error. So yes, the polls were saying that, it looked like we might have a Harris victory, or it was really close, or we might have a split in the swing states. But if you actually analyze those in that right-hand column, the margin of error is usually 3 to 3.5%, depending on the size of the sample there. But all of those are within that margin, except for one that's 1 point off. So the polls were doing what they were supposed to do. It's just that we interpret the polls to mean something that they really don't. They're saying this is a guess that's within a range. I was going to say this at the end, but one of the things we might consider doing if we really want to use polls for predicting election outcomes is have giant samples. We need much bigger polling organizations doing much bigger samples so that we can reduce that margin of error. If polling organizations, came together to do big work on election years, maybe that could work. But as it is, the margin of error is still there, and we have kind of a 50-50 electorate, so it's likely to always happen like that. Another thing I wanted to point out is that this is part of a bigger pattern. So if we look over this last administration, or the last several years at least, inflation has been problematic, right? Like everyone realizes that if you go to the grocery store, you go to eat at a restaurant or whatever. But our inflation rates have been actually better than our peer nations. And so if you look at it in a bigger context, the international context, it's a different story. Same is true with our election. So my colleague, Nancy Lapp, who does comparative politics, actually put a list together. So just within the last year, in a bunch of other countries around the world, the incumbent party has been kicked out of office in favor of more populist parties. So this pattern is not just us. This is not something that's just happening in the United States. So it happened in October in Botswana, in May in South Africa, in October in Japan, in April in South Korea, in April in India, in the UK in July 4th, in France this summer, and then in Germany, their coalition fell apart and they're going to have elections next year. So that's still up in the air. But that's 3 other continents besides ours where this is happening. This is a worldwide phenomenon of the incumbent party being ejected in favor of someone with a more populist message. So, people are dissatisfied with how their democracy is operating, not just here. So, for example, the Pew Research Center did a survey of 24 countries last year in 2023. And while most respondents do favor a representative democracy, 77%, they also found that a median of 59% are dissatisfied with how their democracy is functioning. And 74% think elected officials don't care what people like them think. So that's kind of a similar message to what we're hearing from voters in this country. It's not just us. I suspect that part of the reasoning for that is something that we're not maybe even consciously thinking about, but malaise from COVID, in many ways. So, one is the economic impacts of it with the supply chains and the lockdowns and so forth, but also just the emotional impact that we've all been dealing with. And maybe we don't identify that as why we're upset with our country or with our government, but it was traumatic for everyone. And this is, almost unique in human history, and I guess not entirely unique, but it's relatively unusual for the whole world to go through a traumatic event simultaneously. Like, nobody escaped this. Many people died, many people lost family members, but all of us at least lost a lot of our regular lives for some period of time, right? So we probably haven't processed that very well, and we're targeting whoever we can, and that might be our elected officials who we're throwing out. So hopefully something will make us feel better, right? So it's part of this bigger pattern. So we shouldn't think that this is just something that's, Trump voters or something that's going on just here. And then the populist thing. So just the definition that Levitsky and Ziblatt, who wrote How Democracies Die, they're Harvard professors, what they use as a definition is anti-establishment politicians who claim to represent the voice of the people, wage war on what they depict as a corrupt and conspiratorial elite. Populists tend to deny the legitimacy of established parties, attacking them as undemocratic and even unpatriotic. They tell voters that the existing system is not really a democracy, but instead has been hijacked, corrupted, or rigged by the elite. And they promise to bury that elite and return power to the people. So it sounds pretty familiar if you followed this campaign, right? And it's not just here, right? It's across the world. So people voted against, many observers, if you're sort of, and I suspect pretty much everybody in this crowd pays a lot of attention. Like, how many of you still read a print newspaper? Okay, like most people in this room still read a print newspaper, not everybody. But that's not that common anymore, right? But if you do that, you're really used to a systematic gathering of information. And you probably have some feelings about the preservation of democracy and, reasonable government by qualified folks who serve in government and so forth, right? And for many people, it feels like the country has said no to that, right? That they want something more chaotic and, more destruction of the traditional institutions, right? So I want to kind of explain why I think that's going on to some extent using some of the things that I've been studying. So one is the lack of systematic and high quality news gathering. So, if you're someone who has been making a pattern through your life of really, taking in news in a systematic way, this seems kind of foreign. In our household, we subscribe to like 7 newspapers. Most of it's digital, but we still get one on, this paper, and then take in podcasts, and it's overkill, really, way too much, and it's been painful lately. But if you're used to that, it's really hard to imagine this universe that so many other people live in, wherein they're not taking in hardly any political information, but especially not in a systematic way. So this semester, I'm teaching Intro to American Politics GE class, freshmen, 214 students in the class. So I use this microphone, a microphone like this, to teach too. But when we were doing a section on mass media, I asked them, well, how do people who are really informed about politics and policy, what do you think they do? What are their habits of gathering news? And, they were pretty stumped. And then some of them said, well, they probably like Google things they're interested in and then try to figure it out from there. And I said, well, how do you know what you're interested in if you don't know what just happened today, right? Like, how could that work? And they were stumped. They don't do that. They don't systematically take in news the way you do if you read a daily newspaper or even watch, the nightly news or even cable TV, right? They don't do any of that. They're getting their information randomly online via whatever the algorithm feeds them. And that algorithm can take them down rabbit holes of misinformation or at least just give them limited types of content, right? And that's where most of them are gathering their news. So that's one of the big problems, right? So if you look at this chart, we can see that the yellow is never read a newspaper. And you can see that has skyrocketed. This data ends 4 years ago, so it's even worse now than it looks like on this chart. The dark blue is every day. You can see that has just drastically decreased and was just, 12, 13% 4 years ago. So it's got to be even worse now. So very few people are doing that kind of skimming of the headlines, getting all the basic information from a relatively trustworthy source, where journalists are going out and gathering new information and maybe doing investigative journalism and all that good stuff that we think democracy needs. Here's another sad thing about younger people. They also don't even watch TV. They don't have televisions. Like our students, I teach media and politics, and I'll talk about local TV news or about cable news or whatever, and they're like, "What's that?" I have to show them so they even know what it looks like. Yeah, but news websites and apps, but social media is the big one for the young people. That's where they're getting their content from. And as we know, there's no gatekeeper for that. There's lots of misinformation. There's lots of really awful content, frankly, that is sucking them in. So they're getting bad information. It's even worse for Latinos are more likely to use it than others, right? To use this bad information. Whereas for white and Black respondents, they're, more similarly matched in terms of their use of social media, but we see it more in groups that shifted in this electoral cycle, right? They're using these bad sources of information to gather their information. And then we have the news bubble issue, and that is where it didn't used to be the case, but it is the case now. We can tune into news content that confirms our beliefs and very little else, right? And many people do take in their news that way. The numbers are not as high as you would imagine, though, because so many people just don't take in news at all, right? But among those who do, there's a fair amount of that bubbling. And it's not the same between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, so this is trust. And you can see that, and there's a lot, this is from the Pew Research Center, and there are a lot more charts and graphs, but I didn't want to show you 1,000 of them. But essentially, Republicans center around Fox News in particular. And that comes out again and again in different studies that tons of them trust Fox News and other right-wing sources. I'll show you another one that has that. They don't trust the other mainstream sources. Democrats, on the other hand, are using a lot of different sources that they rely on and that they trust. And so we're living in these very different media environments and news gathering environments. So on the right, it's mostly right-leaning sources. On the left, it's more varied, right? So it's middle of the road, more traditional objectivity standards sorts of reporting, like NPR or BBC or PBS. And then some that might lean left, like MSNBC. But it's not just that right-wing thing. So it's not the same between Democrats and Republicans. Here's another one where you see it's even more pronounced as the further you go towards consistently conservative, consistently liberal. It's that Fox News pattern again. And if you look at the consistently liberal, it's more spread out. And then the newspaper thing is also different between the parties where, so this one is a little bit confusing. Ignore this line. That's just from the cut and paste from it. Don't ignore that part. So Biden voters were using national network news, and then the digital websites includes websites for newspapers. So they're using those sorts of sources more, but the YouTube and Google is used more by Republicans and social media and cable news. So we're taking in different sources that lead to outcomes that are not the same either. So one more example of that. This is each of these sources and what share of their viewership or listenership or whatever is Democrat or Republican, and then how big is how many people get their news from that outlet. So Sean Hannity, Newsmax, One American News, which is a cable to the right of Fox, the Mark Levin Show, Breitbart, Fox News, all dominated by Republican viewers. And then once again, you see this more variety that are more dominated by Democrats on pretty much all the rest, including ones that lean left, but also ones that are more down the middle. So we're not getting the same sorts of information. Well, we end up with effects from that. This is an oldie but a goodie. This is from 2003. So it's right after the war on terror started, I guess we called it then. And we had just gone into Iraq. So this was a question on the PIPA survey, which was did we find evidence of Al-Qaeda being linked to Iraq? Which we did not. There was no connection between the two. In fact, the leaders of the two organizations hated each other. Were WMDs found? They were not. And was world public opinion in favor of it? And it was not. Well, folks who got their news from Fox News were much more likely to believe more of those misperceptions because that's what Fox News was telling them, obviously. And people who use PBS, NPR were the least likely to have those misperceptions. So a middle of the road sort of outlet that was more favorable to understanding the reality in the world. And then even amongst Republicans, the Fox News viewers were more misinformed than those who used other sources. So using these especially partisan sources that sometimes traffic in misinformation has impacts, right? It really does change the way people view the political world. This is an example from this election. So Republicans and independents were more likely to think we were in a recession. This is from May of this year. We were in a recession briefly during the COVID time period, but then we had a recovery, and we've had steady recovery since then. So we're actually doing pretty well. We're doing better. This is GDP per capita. It's been improving after the recovery from the recession. And yet there's this misperception, right? So, and it's stronger amongst Republicans, but if you look at that, 49% of Democrats think so too. So this information is leaking into, the ears of all Americans, even though it's not the case if you ask economists or you look at data. And then this is also from this year. And this is two different polls. The top one is from a different poll, but What we're measuring here is correct responses. Further to the right is more correct. And the Fox or conservative news outlets are the red. And so they get this one right more than anyone else. Over the last few years, unauthorized border crossings at the US-Mexico border are at or near the highest level in decades. That's true over the last several years. But then these other questions that were very relevant in the election, the US stock market is at or near all-time highs. That's true. It's the newspaper readers that get that right, the people in that more middle of the road. FEMA has been withholding aid from disaster areas. That was such a horrible piece of misinformation because it actually impacted the recovery. That was false. Newspaper readers get that right. Fox News viewers don't. Violent crime rates are at or near all-time highs in most major American cities. That's false. Almost no Fox News folks think that's false, right? That was a very salient thing that they felt in the campaign, but it's not true. Inflation in the US has declined over the last year and is near historic averages. That's true. Same thing. Almost none of them believe that, but people who use newspapers mostly do. And then just over the last few months has the border been at a record level, and it has not. Over the last few months, it's gotten better. And again, we see that same disparity. So these were issues that were very much at play that people reported in the exit polls that they voted based on, but many of them were falsehoods. And those falsehoods came across disproportionately to people who were taking in information from these partisan sources, but particularly right-leaning sources. Another example, and this is from those same questions, but instead of looking at their news sources, we're looking at their vote. And you can see that the votes also reflected the misinformation or correct misinformation, essentially. Part of this is being exacerbated by this new realignment that's I wouldn't have predicted if 10, 15 years ago. So traditionally, the Republican Party has been the party of the more educated and the upper class, right? So you think about country club Republicans or people with higher income levels, which is correlated with with education. Traditionally, those have been more likely Republicans. But we're starting to see this shift with the Trump era. And we've seen it especially in this election cycle, where we're starting to see more educated folks lean towards the left and less educated folks lean towards the right. So that it's, an educational realignment of the parties, which wasn't necessarily expected. So this is from exit polls from this election, and you can see that folks with a bachelor's degree or an advanced degree were more likely to vote Harris, and those who never attended college were especially likely to vote Trump. So we're seeing this differential that's emerging that also has something to do with working with the class and income questions, right? That these also correlate. And so we're starting to see more people who are in working class jobs side with Trump and the Republicans. Here's yet another take on this, so that you can see how this has been shifting over time. So you can see back in 1980, there's almost, if the line is kind of straight, that means there's almost no correlation. There's not a connection between party and education, and that was true in 80 and 84 and 88. We start to see it a little bit in 92, but as you see, we move forward in time, it gets steeper and steeper and more sorted out. So on the left here, we have GOP vote share. So further up here is more Republican, further down here is more Democratic. And then the share of adults with college degrees, it's more towards the right. And so you can see that we're really sorting, right? It's getting a higher correlation, and it's sorting blue and red by education level. And then there's some misinformation, or maybe people are faulting Biden and Harris for their communication on economic issues, which probably makes sense because the messaging on that did not come out. People did not collect the information about what was really going on with the economy. So this one is asking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really about environmental programs. So the name is a little bit misleading. The idea was that it would, reduce inflation by creating more jobs and building green facilities and encouraging things like solar panels and giving subsidies for those things and so forth. But it was really about environmental sorts of climate change proposals. So I'm not really focusing necessarily on that specific act, but just over here on the right is the people who say they don't know enough about it to say, which is huge. That's a huge number with all of these segments. And what we know from surveys is that people are kind of shy about saying they don't know because it makes you look kind of dumb, right? And so you just a lot of people will just make something up instead of saying they don't know. So the fact that a large chunk of them were willing to say, like, I have no idea what this thing is about, that's pretty remarkable. Probably a lot of those in this green category, which is not much difference. Probably those are a lot of don't knows too that chose to pick something so that they didn't look like they didn't know. So most people didn't know anything about what this act was, which was a major Biden accomplishment that they were very proud of, that, Harris should have probably campaigned on more, talked about more, and that did, benefit people economically, especially working class people, helping build all these facilities, right? And then here's another example of a differential that's really interesting that's just starting now. So this is the lighter color is the consumer sentiment from surveys, like that we're actually observing from surveys over time going back to 1980. And then the darker is what you would expect based on the actual economic data. So we look at the reality in the actual world and then what people think about it, right? And that's what those two lines are. And you can see they're actually pretty close together through most of the history, right? Like people are accurately saying in polls what the economy is like pretty closely. But then it diverges in 2020. And, we have COVID and the world is a much stranger place then, but it diverges really sharply, right? So at that end, we have the lowest ever survey response about the economy. But then the actual economic data, that darker number up there, is actually pretty high, right? So this is a huge differential between what people think about the economy and the reality of the economy. So that's misinformation that's impacting the way people are viewing the administration, the campaigns, the candidates, the parties. That is not reality, right? So next I want to move on to some stuff from political psychology that might help explain the election outcome. So one is that we actually do have legitimate differing understandings of the same reality. So sometimes we can all view the same event or view the same candidate and think of them completely differently. And it's hard for us to understand that somebody could believe something completely different from what we see. So, if you watch that Madison Square Garden rally, you might have been appalled or worried or thought like, wow, that was really racist. But some people watched it and said, that was amazing, I love it more. They watched the same thing, but had different perceptions. So I don't know if you guys remember this one. You do? Okay, what color is the dress? Blue and black? Anybody have a different view? Really, this whole, it's white and gold, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, is it blue and black or is it white and gold? See, it's kind of half and half in here. Yeah. So those are completely different, right? Like white and blue and black and gold, those are totally different colors. And right in this room, we have a disagreement on it and we're looking at the same damn picture, right? So I use this example in another one that we can't make work because it's audio and somehow the computer wouldn't do it. But I don't know if you saw the Yanny Laurel thing. Look it up if you want to, but it's audio and some people hear Yanny and some people hear Laurel. So what's happening with this one is it's how our eyes are interpreting the light. So we adjust mentally for what the light situation is. I guess people who don't get out in the sun enough think it's white, or maybe it's the other way around. I don't remember. Is that it? Yeah. Like you spend too much time inside if you do one or the other, but I can't remember which one it is. And and then the Yanny Laurel one is higher or lower pitches, and which one you're more attuned to, and you hear one or the other thing, which is kind of a trip. So we can observe the same candidate and the same situation and legitimately not pretending and not, trying to be mean to each other. We can legitimately see and feel different things, right? And that's hard to think sometimes, but it maybe helps us understand each other, like extend some kindness. So another thing from political psychology is that we have a bias towards trusting people when they say things. Like we want, this is beautiful and also sad, right? Like we want to believe people are telling us the truth. We want to trust people when they speak to us. And so we inherently just have this tendency to believe when people tell us stuff. And then we also prefer simplicity in many cases because it's simple, it's easier to remember, it's easier to repeat. And then we also have an authority towards, or excuse me, a bias towards authority. When someone's in authority, we're more likely to believe what they're saying. So if you combine all of those cognitive biases, Trump, his closing argument was literally this phrase, Harris broke it, but I will fix it. It couldn't get simpler, right? Like that's incredibly simple. Sounds great. We would love everything fixed, right? And so if you take that at face value, you're going to vote for Trump because Harris gave a much more complicated story about different programs and different approaches, and then you'd have to look at the policies of the Biden administration to figure it out. But this guy comes along and just says, I'll fix it. That's very appealing, and so that's one of the reasons that folks went that way. And then we also have a lot of subconscious biases that I've done some research on the gender biases, but we don't necessarily always recognize that that's what's happening in our minds, right? So misogyny is a real thing that many people have on a deep level. I don't know if you've ever taken the IAT tests that you can look these up online, implicit association tests. So you can try these online where you'll be given different prompts and you have to categorize them as, like, say, positive or negative. You're given a word and you categorize it. And what the computer is doing is figuring out how quickly you can do it. So if the response fits with what you really believe, then you can do it more quickly or more fluent in it. And if it takes you a second to override maybe your racism or your sexism, it takes a little bit longer. And so you can tell if people have these inherent biases that they may not consciously even believe or realize. So the first time I took one of these on gendered stuff, I found out that I was sexist. That was very hurtful to me. And I was teaching women in politics. So I was like, damn it. But we get this stuff from our environment, right? Like it sinks in whether we want it to or not. So if you ask me, do I discriminate against women and think they're less capable? Of course I wouldn't say that, right? But it showed up on that test. And most people who take these will find that they show up. Now they have them for disability, sexuality, all kinds of different versions that you can take to see if you have an implicit bias against a group. And you may have an internalized one against your own group. So we don't necessarily know that we have them, but when you hear people say things like, I don't know enough about Harris to know if I can vote for her, probably that's really what's going on, right? They don't consciously realize that that's it, but they just somehow have a reservation about it. It doesn't feel quite right to them. Really, probably what's going on is that they have an issue with women in leadership, but that's not what even to themselves, they probably aren't realizing that. And the same thing can happen with race. And she had both of those characteristics that were working against her, likely, even with people who wouldn't say that that was a problem for them. So some ideas for the way forward. One would be better media literacy. A lot of these things I was talking about with the disinformation would not sink in the same ways if people had better abilities to resist it, especially when they see it in social media or online or places that are not vetted. One of the things that I'm hopeful about is that here in California and in some other states, we have new legislation here, AB 873, that's just about to go into effect, that will have media literacy programs in K through 12, not just as sort of a standalone course or something, but integrated into the curriculum of all sorts of disciplines. So in science class, in English class, in all sorts of different courses, they will integrate this media literacy content. So that would be amazing if we could teach people early to be more critical when they think about and absorb media. That could help. The fighting of misinformation. It's hard. I've been a little bit depressed about it because that's something I've been working on for many years. With PI, we had a partnership with KCRA for many years where we did fact checks on campaign advertising. And we, at one time early on, we actually got an ad pulled from the air because it wasn't true. What a quaint time we used to live in, right? Like, it's adorable. Yeah. So that would never happen anymore, right? We had a partnership with Channel 10 locally to do a series on misinformation where their voters, or excuse me, where their viewers would call in or write in and say, hey, there's this thing that I don't understand what's going on. Can you clear it up? And then we would, provide that information on the air for them. So I've been working on this kind of stuff and doing research on it for many years. But it's getting worse. And AI is making it worse. And active disinformation campaigns by the Russians and others is making it worse. But I still think that there's room for research to be done to help us understand how we might deal with it, because it's not going to be prevented. One of the promising lines of research is on this idea of pre-bunking, where you let people, it's sort of like inoculation, where you let people know, hey, if you look at the source, somebody's trying to convince you of something, and it's possible and even likely that they're trying to convince you of something that's not true. You're being manipulated. And when people realize that, that can be helpful. If they're given a little, sort of like inoculation, like a little bit of the untruth that they can then pick apart, when they get the whole untruth, they're ready to fight it. So there is research showing that that could be the case. So there could be campaigns to do more of that sort of pre-bunking. There's this concept that's been around for a little while, which is that journalists, when they're correcting misinformation, should do what's called the truth sandwich. So unfortunately, what they do a lot of the times is they'll just say, hey, this is wrong, and here's the correct information. When they do that, they repeat the false information, in order to give the context, which puts it in our minds even more. The first thing you hear, you're more likely to remember. It's very hard to get it out. So if they do it again, they're making it worse. And then you don't remember the correction. You would have to have the correction as more times than you heard the original misinformation. And that almost never happens. You just hear it once. So the technique that journalists should be using is providing the correct information first, and then saying, here's the misinformation about it, and then reiterating the correct information, the truth sandwich. So that it has been shown to be effective. Journalists still don't do it that much. When we had that partnership with Channel 10, I went to one of their meetings to talk about, hey, do this. And I think they did a pretty good job of doing it, that election cycle. But you see it so much in the press that they don't, right? They just provide the information. Or even fact-checking sites seem like they're going to be useful. I've done research on the efficacy of fact-checking. Unfortunately, most of the time, you only look up the ones that you want to see are false because they're from the other party, right? You don't look up your own party. You don't want to see that you're wrong. And so it doesn't really help that much. I still think it's good because we need the record, but it's not as efficacious as it could be. So we need more research into what does work and more use of what does work. I'm currently doing some research on the phrasing that journalists use when they do those corrections. Do they call it a lie? Do they call it without evidence? Without evidence is the one that I think doesn't work. And I have some preliminary evidence that this is true. Because when you say they asserted without evidence, it's possible that there is evidence still. They just didn't happen to mention it, right? Like the evidence might exist, but they just didn't say it. What the journalist really means is that they made this shit up. Sorry, I'm sorry. It's recorded. Stuff. They made this stuff up. The kids these days are getting to me. Like they just do it. They'll ask questions in class with swear words in it, and I'm like, what? Anyway, sorry. So, more of this work on misinformation, I think, is still necessary, and we need to, double down on it. I also think we need to extend some understanding to our fellow Americans. There's, from the cult deprogramming literature, the way that you can, start to get people to maybe understand more reality is not to challenge them, not to call them, wrong or stupid, which is what everybody does online, right? It doesn't work. But instead listen to them and ask them like, well, why do you believe that? Like, how does that make you feel? And gradually kind of get into their headspace and get their trust and start to understand why they think that. And then maybe plant a little seed. So it's much harder, and you're probably not going to do that with the people on X or whatever, but you might be able to do it with people in your life. And it's just less harsh. We probably need more coming together in, all kinds of ways. And then the last one is just, if we want to think polls predict, like I already said, outcomes, we need much larger sample sizes so that we can get more accurate polling. It's not that polling is broken, although it's much more challenging than it ever was before. It's that our assumptions that we're making from it are just too much for it to bear in the current model. We need a much bigger sample sizes. Okay. So, few takeaways. 2024 wasn't a landslide, and it was in line with global patterns. The news gathering habit shifts have made accurate information more difficult to get. News diets are tied to opinions and votes, and sometimes, it's misinformation and it's not reality. Dis and misinformation. So sorry, I didn't even clarify these two. So misinformation is when you have perceptions that are factually untrue. Disinformation is when it's done purposely, right? So like the Russian disinformation campaign is intentionally trying to deceive. You can get misinformation from like a parody site that you took literally, right? It's not on purpose, but it still happens. So both are happening. I'm worried more about disinformation now than ever before, though. But that disinformation is asymmetrical. We actually do see more of it on the right. People don't want to say that because we want to be fair and balanced, and I want to be fair and balanced too, but it's reality. It's not the same on both sides. And then personality and cognitive biases help explain the ways we perceive things differently and had different reactions in this election. And it's going to be a rough 4 years. I can't say that. Like, I wanted to have some hopefulness in this talk, but it's going to be difficult. Let's get real. And then the development office would like me to point out that you could donate to Pi at this website. We hire students, we put on events, rent space, this year we started getting what we call little pies. It's really tarts. So pie at Pi events, come on, that's fun. And do, work on misinformation and on initiative explainers and things like that. So if you're so inclined, there's a link on that website. All right, questions?
I wonder if you would comment on a phenomenon that I think and I've been voting for a long time, that I've never seen until Trump came on the scene. And that is a large percentage of his followers who seem to be immune to the facts, even when given the facts or given a passage from Project 2025 or given a quote from one of his rallies, dismiss it and maybe even go on to explain that no matter what he says, or in the famous example, even if he shoots somebody on Fifth Avenue, I'm still going to vote for him. I don't think that ever applied to Adlai Stevenson or Dwight Eisenhower or Richard Nixon or anybody else. Why do we have so many people here that even if you tried to inform them, they would not change their vote?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of that phenomenon. Like, do you see anybody driving around with trucks with like Harris flags and, like their whole identity is about like Harris or Biden or Obama even? No, it's a very different phenomenon. So I think historically in political science, especially, we would always look at politics, political decisions as like kind of these rational calculations you're making based on policy. That's not it, right? None of it's about rationality. It's very emotional and it's very tribal. Like, that's the new thing in political science, is that party identification is tribal identity. And so it's team sports, and the leader of your team needs to be propped up and supported no matter what. And people are taking it on as part of their identity in a way that we never used to, right? Like, if you go back in time, people were friends across political lines. You wouldn't, necessarily identify even as like a Democrat or Republican. You might say like, I vote that way, but you wouldn't say I am a. We're taking it on as identity in a way that we never did before, but especially the Trump followers, right? I don't think you see something similar on the left, and I don't imagine we will. But there's this, I could go deeper in the political psychology, but I don't know if we want to, but there's something called authoritarian personality disorder that we sometimes measure. We've done some, and disorder sounds offensive, so sometimes I don't like to use it, but we did some research on support for political protest, and we measured that, and we found that was the biggest factor in lack of support for political protest. Whether it was on the left or the right, people who are high in authoritarianism didn't want political protests because it's all about hierarchy and obedience and so forth. And so when that characteristic comes out in folks, their obedience to the leader becomes more important than anything else, right? And so if people are high on that characteristic, they're much more likely to follow Trump. That's the short version. Yes.
You talked about Republicans and Democrats. What about independents?
Yeah. So our system is kind of ridiculous in that we act as if there's just a binary of opinion and ideas, and of course, two parties do it. But we have a system set up structurally that forces us that way. So when people study independence, what we find is that it's often, there are some pure independents, right? Some people who really do have issue positions and views that cross both sides or don't align with the party. So like a libertarian might just want less government regardless of what that means, if it's social programs or if it's economics. But most of the time, people who call themselves independents really lean one way or the other. They tend to vote consistently with one party or the other, but they also tend to be less politically attentive and less engaged politically. And so they don't vote as often. So, most of the time in political science, we'll just lean them to whichever side they tend to vote for. And there's really like maybe 1% to 2% of the electorate that's actually truly functionally independent. And so that would be a different category that's very fiercely anti-label, right? And so that's a different psychology there too.
Yeah, I understand that when you argue with someone of the opposing political views and take them head on and point out all of the inconsistencies, that they're not going to change their views that way. However, I do it anyway.
Most people do, yeah.
Because I don't figure I'm going to change that person, and I don't care. What I'm concerned with is influencing the people who are witnessing our exchange. And maybe some of them will see a few flaws in the logic of the person I'm arguing with. And so I'd like to hear your comments on that. And I don't mind if you use 4-letter words in your response.
Oh, I just really wanted to use one in response, but I won't. Yeah, so it depends on who the observers are. If the observers are already aligned with the party, then, have the same effect that it would on the person who's already backed into their position. If you have observers who are new to politics or haven't thought about these things, possibly they could be persuaded, but those people are less likely to be on a forum that's exchanging political ideas like that because they don't care and they don't tune into that stuff. And so the likelihood is that you're having the same impact as you would on the person that you're arguing with, right? That the observers are either on your side or on the other side, and no one's changing their mind. Yeah.
I'm not a political scientist, but you said that this was not a landslide election, that the numbers were pretty close. What percentage of the available voters did not vote as compared to the votes for Harris versus for Trump?
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers, and all of the votes haven't been counted yet. So I've been holding off really digging into that until we have the final numbers. But it's always a significant portion of the population. The turnout rates were not as high in this election as they were in 2020, because it was easier to vote in 2020, right? Because most states had mail-in because of the pandemic. But I think does anybody else have the exact number? It's like 40-some% that didn't. No, of eligible. Yeah, the registered voter number will be less sad.
We have a question online here. Do you expect the mainstream media, NBC, CBS, et cetera, may start reporting positive info about Trump and his administration to avoid a backlash from Trump? Like the LA Times and Washington Post did not endorse a candidate in the election, bowing to DJT exclamation.
I mean, that's the fear that, okay, I'll do the upbeat version, which is that journalists, people who go to journalism school and consider themselves to be mainstream journalists and abide by the standards of the profession do believe in the civic duty aspect of it. And I do think that most of them will fight disinformation and will fight the tendency to bow down to any kind of authoritarian moves, but their owners might be the issue, right? And that's what we saw with the LA Times and the Washington Post. They're looking at the bottom line. They're looking at their other businesses. And so that's where the danger probably is. I don't think it's with the journalists themselves, though. And so there may be quite the discord within the newsrooms across the country.
And the last one here is, I'll paraphrase, what is a larger polling sample size, considering there are about 164 million registered voters?
Yeah.
What would be a representative polling sample?
Yeah, so when I teach this, I always feel bad that I kind of at some point have to say, just trust me on this, because it's not that intuitive. But so you can get, for most purposes, you can get a reasonably good sample with 1,000 respondents, even if we're talking about representing the whole country. And I know that's counterintuitive, but mathematically that's true if it's a truly randomized sample. So if you think about something like a blood test, you don't need a whole lot to get an accurate depiction of what's going on, right? So it's kind of that sort of principle that if it's mixed perfectly, and you just grab a little bit, you can get a good sample with not that many. However, if you start to subdivide that sample and you want to know more things about, like, how did Latinas vote, which is just a smaller portion, then you're no longer going to be as accurate. So if we're doing overall things, 1,000, 1,500 is accurate within that 3 to 3.5% margin of error, which is basically between like 47 and 53, if it was 50, as they said. For most purposes, that's okay, because we don't need it to be absolutely precise, right? We're just looking at tendencies and patterns and so forth, and it's good for that. And it's, has been and still is, and I would defend that. But if we want to drill down on subgroups, or if we want to get really accurate and reduce that margin of error, then the math gets much worse and much more expensive. That's the problem. It's really expensive to do polling. People think like, oh, it's so easy. You just like do a little Survey Monkey thing and boom. But it's really expensive. That's why we're folding Cal Speaks, because it costs like $75,000. We're doing the cheap version and it's still like $75,000 a poll.
I think we're just about out of time.
Oh,
And she had a quick
so
question.
we'd have to have like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands to get really precise.
I just wanted to make a comment that what really resonates with me is your part about giving voice to people who have an alternate opinion or experience. I feel like that's the hopefulness thing that we
Yeah.
can leave this
Yeah.
conversation with, that's something we can all do, because I know that when people have the opportunity to speak about what they experience and what's real for them, they tend to move towards more open-mindedness and learning. So I
Yes,
just wanted to comment.
absolutely. Thank you for doubling down on that. Let's leave on a hopeful note.
Okay, Kim, this was marvelous and very informative, very enlightening. So thank you very, very much. As you probably know, we honor our speakers with a membership in the Renaissance Society. I hope you'll have some time to take advantage of that. I'm guessing you probably won't, and we also, or at least not immediately, but we also make a donation in your honor to the Seth Nelson Emergency Grant Fund for the students. So, but thank you. This was just terrific, and we hope to have you back maybe on a more positive note in 4 years.